Hi everyone, it's Miss Sheehan, and today we're going to do a lecture on the motivations for European exploration in the 1400s. Okay, so please go ahead and take notes on this in your notebook. All right, so the age of exploration refers to the period in the late 1400s when Europeans begin to explore the rest of the world, and they primarily do this via water, right, the oceans. So they are able to do this at this point because of several improvements in map making, right? They're able to see where to go, shipbuilding, and navigation, right? So these improvements in technology, primarily that came from the increased diffusion because of the Mongol Empire, right, lead to Europeans being able to explore more of the world than they previously had. And this included what's called blue water sailing, which is where you sail out of sight of land, right? And where before a lot of Europeans had really kind of stuck close to land. And that really limits your ability to explore, especially across large oceans like the Atlantic. Right. And so Europeans begin exploring out of kind of the bounds of European territory. Okay, so we're going to go over a couple motivations for this exploration. The first was high demand, right? So remember that prior to this, in the 1200s and 1300s, the unified Mongol Empire brought really speedy trade routes, right, as we've talked about. And these routes sped up the flow of resources to Europe in a way that really had never been seen before. So Europe's demand, right, the stuff that people want for resources grows because people get used to having access to things that they previously didn't have access to. And the big thing was spices, right? Remember, most spices were grown only in very particular areas in Asia and particularly in Indonesia, right? So because of these quicker trade routes, Europe gets used to having access to spices. So as the Mongol Empire declines and breaks up into the four khanates, right, the four sections, as you can see in this map here, right, after the death of Genghis Khan, overland trade across these trade routes begins to slow down and weaken. So not only because of the breakdown of Mongol unity, but also because of the Black Death, right? As we talked about, the Black Death spread to Europe via trade routes. So people, right, not only is there this big dying off, but people also stop traveling as often over these overland trade routes. So the weakening of these trade routes caused the slowing of movement for resources. So all of a sudden, right, Europe couldn't get that many goods that it had gotten used to, like spices. But Europe still has a really high demand. People still want these things. They had gotten used to having them in their lives. They still want them, even though the trade routes are breaking down, right? And the prices were really high for valued items like spices. So that's a big motivation for people going out and exploring, was to basically make money, find quicker trade routes from Europe to the Indian Ocean, to Asia, and to Indonesia, so they could make money off of bringing these goods back that had traditionally gone through these overland trade routes. Right? So the motivations included a high demand for resources such as spices, high prices for those resources, and people wanted to control trade routes. Now that they were no longer controlled by the Mongols, right, it's in people's best interest to control them because of things like taxes and, limited resources, as well as competition, right? People wanted to make money off of these resources. So the effect of this was that explorers searched for fast water routes to obtain spices and other goods for lower price. For example, right, think about, where was Columbus going, right? If you don't know, we'll talk about it in a minute. Okay. Other motivations included innovations and new technology, including a ship called the Caravel. And the Caravel was a ship that had two masts, and the mast is this big wooden thing in the center that holds up the sails, right? So with two masts, you could have more sails, which means more area for wind to push the ship, so you could sail faster. And also this type of ship could sail what's called against the wind. So as the wind blows towards the ship, right, the ship could go basically diagonally across it. So they weren't limited by the wind having to be on the side or the back of the ship. So they could go in new places. And the last motivation was ideologies, right? A lot of sailors and explorers from Europe were ambitious men looking to rise in the social order, right? They wanted to be famous, they wanted to be rich. And as they begin to explore different areas, especially in Central and South America and Africa, Europeans see these non-white people, these indigenous people who are living there, as not on their own level, right? As not, maybe as sophisticated or civilized as white people. But as we'll look at next time, right? Many of these civilizations, Aztec, the Inca, right, many African civilizations like the Mali and Ghana Empire, were extremely sophisticated and civilized nations that had existed for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. But for a lot of Europeans, they thought of themselves as superior, right? So this was a way for Europeans to basically justify them taking over these areas that didn't belong to them, right? And were in fact owned and controlled by people who had already lived there, right? And then crush them and take their resources to sell in Europe, right? So that was a way they justified their exploration to themselves by saying that the people who already lived there were not as good as them, as the white Europeans. And that's an ideology that continues throughout kind of the European conquest of the world for really the next 400 to 500 years. Okay, so we're going to look at two particular European explorers. The first is Vasco de Gama. So Vasco de Gama was a Portuguese explorer, right? Portugal is that little country right next to Spain. And in 1497, he sails around Africa, discovering a route from Europe to the Indian Ocean. And he was the first European to successfully sail around the Indian Ocean, or around Africa, and around the Cape here, and then go up into the Indian Ocean. So Europe could now, because of his exploration, access the Indian Ocean and East Asia, right? India, China, Indonesia, Japan, without going overland through the Middle East. Previous to this, they had not been able to do that. They had to depend on the Middle East. So this has several really important consequences. The first is that the Middle East is now left out of international trade, right? Sending the region into a long-term decline. Whereas before, the Middle East and the empires there had been really the center of international trade from Asia to Europe and Africa, right? Now, Europeans and Asians can go around them, right? And basically leave them out. And also, Vasco da Gama's voyage establishes what's called Portugal's trading post empire, where basically they take control of many cities along the African coast, right? And set up this like system where people who trade there have to pay them tax, have to pay the Portuguese taxes, which makes Portugal extremely rich. And it also connects Central and Southern Africa to Europe for really the first time. Before this, really the only contact that Europe had with Africa was Northern Africa above the Saharan desert. And many important consequences, this sets up the slave trade between Europe and Africa. And eventually that slave trade will involve Europe, Africa, South America, and North America. And so we'll talk about that, right? And that leads to really 400 years of people being forcibly brought across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay. The second explorer is Christopher Columbus, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Christopher Columbus was actually an Italian explorer, but he was hired by the Spanish monarchs to find a faster way to the Spice Islands, which were Indonesia, right? Or the East Indies is what they called. So he decided to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and he runs into the Americas, and he in fact lands in the Caribbean, right? And he calls it the West Indies, right? Because he was trying to get to the East Indies, which is Indonesia. He calls it the West Indies, which is why people have referred to people who live in North and Central America as Indians, right? Even though they're not from India. So his voyage leads to the first sustained wave of diffusion between the Americas, North, Central, and South America, and Africa, Europe, and Asia. And this is called the Columbian Exchange. And his voyage also is the beginning of the Spanish and Portuguese empires in Central and South America, which is we'll talk about next time. So overall consequences of the age of exploration ends in the 1700s with Western Europe, particularly Portugal and Spain, but also Great Britain and France, as well as some other countries like the Netherlands, controlling most of North and South America, right? Portugal controls what becomes Brazil, Spain controls Central America, Mexico, the top of South America. Britain obviously takes over the east coast of North America. France takes over kind of the north of North America, right? And Europeans take over control of the main trade routes of the Indian Ocean. So as before, the Mongols and primarily the Middle Eastern, so the Abbasid and the Ottoman empires had controlled the trade routes from Asia to Europe. Now Europeans control that. And so that has great consequences for kind of the rest of world history that we're going to look at throughout the rest of this year. Okay, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you next time.